By the time December settled over America, it did not arrive gently. It came like a held breath that had been waiting all year to be released, heavy with the weight of unfinished arguments and unresolved fears. Storefronts glowed with holiday lights, but the warmth felt rehearsed, almost defiant, as if joy itself were trying to prove something. Inside living rooms and crowded airports, in diners open late and newsrooms that never slept, Americans closed the year with the same question humming beneath every other thought: what exactly are we walking into next? The country looked calm on the surface. The stock market ticked along, the highways filled with travelers, children rehearsed school plays. But beneath that normalcy ran a current of anxiety so steady it began to feel permanent. Conversations drifted, inevitably, toward politics, not in the fiery, ideological way of years past, but with a weary inevitability. Trump loomed over it all, not always spoken of directly, but present like a silhouette at the edge of the room. For some, he represented return and reckoning. For others, a threat they could feel in their chest before they could explain it in words. And for many more, he symbolized exhaustion, the sense that the country was trapped in a loop it could not escape. Television screens reflected this mood back at the nation. Pundits spoke in calmer tones now, but the calm was deceptive, like the stillness before a storm. Every panel discussion circled the same themes: polls tightening, court cases dragging on, rallies drawing crowds that refused to shrink. Headlines used softer language than before, but the implications were sharper. Trump remained central. Trump dominates the conversation. Trump reshapes the race without holding office. It wasn't just analysis, it was acknowledgement. No matter how much America tried to look ahead, it kept finding itself staring at the same figure. In small towns and big cities alike, people argued less loudly than they once had. The shouting had burned itself out. Now there was something more unsettling: quiet resignation mixed with simmering dread. At family gatherings, politics became the topic that hovered just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable before someone changed the subject. Old friendships learned where the lines were and stepped carefully around them. In workplaces, managers reminded employees to keep discussions professional, knowing full well that professionalism had become a fragile truce rather than a shared value. For Trump supporters, the year's end felt like vindication deferred but not denied. They spoke of resilience, of survival through ridicule and investigation and loss. They watched their candidate endure what they saw as persecution and emerge, still standing, still commanding attention. To them, the worry belonged to everyone else. They believed the country had lost its way and that discomfort was simply the price of correction. In their eyes, Trump wasn't the source of instability, he was proof that the system could still be challenged. For Trump's critics, the feeling was entirely different. The worry was not abstract. It was visceral, rooted in memory. They remembered the chaos, the rhetoric, the sense that norms could evaporate overnight. They saw his continued dominance as evidence that the nation had learned little, healed less. Every new rally clip, every polling surge, every court delay felt like a reminder that the past was not past at all. It was waiting. And then there was the largest group of all, the Americans caught somewhere in between. They were tired of outrage and tired of fear, tired of being told that every election was the most important of their lifetime. They wanted stability, predictability, and a sense that the ground beneath them was solid. But as the year closed, even they could feel the tremor. Something fundamental was being tested, and no amount of disengagement could fully insulate them from it. Institutions felt brittle in a way they hadn't before. Courts moved slowly under the glare of public scrutiny. Election officials spoke with practiced neutrality, yet carried the burden of knowing that their work would be questioned no matter the outcome. Journalists tried to strike a balance between urgency and fatigue, between warning and repetition. Each article felt like it had been written before, yet still had to be written again. Social media amplified everything, but with less joy than in previous years. There were fewer jokes now, fewer attempts to laugh it all off. Instead, timelines filled with clipped arguments, screenshots of headlines, and long threads trying to explain, once more, what was at stake. Even silence became political. Choosing not to comment felt like an act of self-preservation, or in some cases, quiet protest. As New Year's Eve approached, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. A calendar turning, a chance for renewal, collided with the sense that nothing had truly reset. Fireworks would explode over cities, but the underlying tension would remain. America wasn't stepping into a new chapter so much as turning the page and finding the same story, written in darker ink. In bars and living rooms, people made resolutions that felt smaller than usual. Drink less. Spend more time with family. Pay off debt. Fewer spoke about hope for the country in sweeping terms. Hope, when mentioned at all, was cautious, conditional. If things go well. If the system holds. If we can get through this. Trump's name surfaced again and again, not always in anger, sometimes in disbelief. How could one man still command so much attention? How could the nation not move on? The answers depended on who you asked, but the fact itself was undeniable. He was not just a candidate or a former president. He was a gravitational force, bending conversations, loyalties, and fears around himself. As midnight approached, the final hours of the year felt stretched, almost suspended. The country waited, for nothing specific, and yet for everything. There was no single moment that would define what came next, no clear signal that would resolve the uncertainty. Only the knowledge that the coming year would demand choices, and that those choices would carry consequences long after the fireworks faded. When the clocks finally struck 12, cheers erupted across the nation. Glasses clinked. People hugged. For a brief moment, the weight lifted. But as the echoes faded, the worry returned, quieter but unchanged. Trump still loomed large. The questions still hung unanswered. And America stepped into the new year not with confidence, but with a cautious, collective awareness that whatever lay ahead would test the country in ways it was not entirely sure it was ready for. Trump did not need to announce anything new to dominate the year's opening weeks. He was already there, threaded through headlines, court dockets, fundraising emails, and the low-grade hum of cable news that never quite switched off. The country woke up each morning to the same paradox, a man without office exerting more gravitational pull than many who held it. It was not just influence, it was persistence. An insistence on presence that felt, to supporters and critics alike, almost supernatural in its endurance. Rallies became rituals again. Not merely political events, but communal affirmations. People drove hours to stand shoulder to shoulder in hangars and fairgrounds, wearing the familiar red, chanting the familiar lines. The speeches followed a rhythm now perfected by repetition, grievance braided with humor, accusation softened by nostalgia, defiance sharpened by applause. Each rally was covered breathlessly, analyzed endlessly, and argued over bitterly. The cameras loved them. The crowds fed them. And Trump, at the center, appeared energized by the very resistance meant to diminish him. Opponents watched with a mix of alarm and disbelief. They had expected time to erode the spectacle, scandal to sap the momentum. Instead, time seemed to concentrate it. Legal trouble did not shrink his audience, it rearranged it. Where some drifted away, others arrived with fiercer loyalty, convinced that endurance itself was proof of righteousness. The narrative hardened: if he was still standing, it must mean something. In American politics, survival has always been a kind of currency. The courtrooms were quieter than the rallies, but their stakes felt heavier. Lawyers spoke in measured tones about motions and timelines, while the public translated each update into hope or dread. Delays became symbols. A postponed hearing wasn't just procedural, it was a sign, interpreted wildly, of either justice grinding forward or justice being avoided. Trump used these pauses expertly, filling the silence with his own declarations, framing the law as both adversary and foil. To his base, the cases proved persecution. To his critics, they proved urgency. To the undecided, they proved confusion. Media organizations tried to recalibrate. Editors debated headlines. Producers weighed airtime. Every mention risked amplification, every omission risked irrelevance. The phrase, coverage dilemma, became a quiet confession inside newsrooms. Trump's presence distorted incentives. Ignore him and lose the audience. Cover him and fuel the fire. No algorithm, no editorial policy, no ethical framework had yet solved the problem of a figure who thrived equally on attention and outrage. Meanwhile, the rest of the political field strained to be heard. Other candidates delivered speeches heavy with policy, toured towns with earnest smiles, and released detailed plans. Their words landed softly, if at all. Comparisons were inevitable and often unkind. They spoke of the future, Trump spoke of himself as the past unfinished. In a culture addicted to drama, his story, open-ended, unresolved, proved harder to look away from. At kitchen tables across the country, conversations grew sharper again. The truce of the holidays dissolved. People tested the waters, asked loaded questions, gauged reactions. "What do you think will happen?" became shorthand for, "Where do you stand?" The answers revealed fault lines that had never truly healed. Some spoke with renewed confidence, others with tightening anxiety. A few admitted, quietly, that they felt trapped between narratives that allowed no middle ground. Trump's genius, critics argued, lay in simplification. He reduced complexity to loyalty and betrayal, strength and weakness. In doing so, he offered clarity in an era that felt overwhelming. The cost of that clarity, nuance, empathy, institutional trust, was paid by the country at large. Supporters countered that the old language had failed them, that bluntness was not cruelty but honesty. The argument circled endlessly, feeding itself, immune to resolution. International observers watched closely. Allies spoke carefully, avoiding names while preparing contingencies. Markets reacted not to policy proposals but to tone, to probability, to mood. America's internal uncertainty spilled outward, a reminder that its elections were never purely domestic events. The question was no longer whether Trump mattered, it was how much of the global order bent around the possibility of his return. Online, the atmosphere thickened. Memes hardened into slogans. Threads grew longer, angrier. Misinformation traveled fast, corrections lagged behind. People retreated into familiar digital neighborhoods where their views were echoed back, louder and sharper. The algorithms rewarded intensity, and Trump provided it in abundance. Each post, each clip, each offhand remark became raw material for another cycle of amplification. Yet beneath the noise, something subtler was happening. Trump's presence was reshaping not just politics, but time itself. The future felt compressed, pulled toward a single decision point. Plans were made with caveats. Investments hedged. Personal choices postponed. The country behaved as if it were waiting for a verdict not yet delivered, unsure whether to move forward or brace for impact. For those who remembered his presidency, the memories resurfaced unbidden. Not just policies or scandals, but feelings, the constant alertness, the sense that each day could bring something unprecedented. Supporters remembered the thrill of disruption. Critics remembered the exhaustion of vigilance. Both remembered intensity, and intensity, once experienced, is difficult to forget. Trump seemed to understand this instinctively. He spoke often of energy, of momentum, of winning. He framed the moment as destiny delayed, a story interrupted before its proper ending. In doing so, he invited Americans to see themselves as characters in that story, choosing sides not just in an election, but in a narrative about the nation's identity. As weeks passed, it became clear that Trump had not merely lingered in American life, he had reorganized it around himself. Every discussion bent in his direction. Every forecast included his shadow. He was the reference point, the measuring stick, the argument's beginning and end. The man who never left had ensured that leaving was no longer an option. By the end of this chapter of the year, one truth stood out with uncomfortable clarity: America was not deciding whether Trump would matter again. It was deciding how much of itself it was willing to risk in order to answer the question he posed simply by remaining. By the time January waned into February, the country had settled into a strange rhythm, one of anticipation, caution, and suspended certainty. Americans were holding their collective breath, though they did not fully realize it. The air felt charged, as if each conversation, each click of a mouse, each headline carried weight that could tilt the national balance. The previous year's anxiety had not dissipated, it had merely evolved. Now, instead of open panic or frustration, there was a quiet tension, a pervasive sense that the nation was waiting for an outcome that could not yet be named. Election officials, courts, and legislators became the invisible protagonists in this drama. Every procedural update, every delayed filing, every procedural announcement was scrutinized to the point of obsession. Lines of code in election systems were dissected by analysts, motions and filings were parsed with the meticulous attention usually reserved for historical documents. Citizens who had never thought about judicial precedents now debated them at dinner tables. Lawyers in suits moved behind courthouse doors, but the public felt their every motion as though it were a seismic tremor. Each postponement, each procedural nuance, was interpreted through the lens of fear and hope, loyalty and doubt. Meanwhile, the broader population found itself caught between impatience and vigilance. Offices, schools, and households alike were permeated by the quiet hum of worry. Conversations were cautious. Social media, once a playground for mockery and debate, had turned into a pressure chamber of anxiety. Memes now carried threat as easily as humor. Every clip of Trump or his allies sparked analysis, commentary, and speculation that sometimes bordered on obsession. People consumed news the way one might observe a slowly rising tide, knowing that missing a single wave could have consequences. Politicians outside the Trump orbit tried to assert themselves, but found the landscape altered in ways that undermined normal political mechanics. Campaign rallies were small, speeches were measured, policy debates were circumspect. It was as if the entire apparatus of governance had been compressed, filtered, and reoriented around the simple question of survival in a politically charged environment. The urgency of daily life, of ordinary decision-making, became entangled with the larger national anxiety, leaving citizens unsure how to prioritize personal stability against collective instability. In homes across the nation, families navigated the tension differently. Some tried to maintain calm, imposing a quiet order on a chaotic reality. Others expressed anxiety openly, arguing in living rooms and kitchens, feeling the tension stretch across generations. Teenagers and young adults absorbed the fear indirectly, through social media and the anxious chatter of elders. Children sensed the underlying currents even if they could not articulate them, understanding that the world outside the schoolhouse walls carried invisible stressors that could not be ignored. The media, for its part, attempted to bridge the gap between information and interpretation, though often imperfectly. Each new leak, each investigative report, each expert opinion became a piece of a larger mosaic that was incomplete and constantly shifting. News cycles compressed into hours, then minutes, then seconds. Americans consumed and interpreted at a speed that matched the intensity of the anxiety surrounding them. The very act of staying informed became a burden, a necessity, and a compulsion all at once. Even culture itself was affected. Entertainment, sports, and leisure were not untouched by political tension. Ratings soared for programs covering political events, films and shows that offered distraction saw viewership decline. Humor became sharper, darker. Satire intensified, no longer just funny but pointed, a tool for processing the weight of reality. Literature, podcasts, and digital essays reflected a country grappling with its own uncertainty, capturing the underlying suspense that pervaded every aspect of civic life. Meanwhile, Trump's strategy remained subtle but relentless. He did not need to push policies through Congress or win elections immediately. His power resided in his ability to shape perception, to define reality indirectly through statements, rallies, and social media presence. Every interaction with him, live or recorded, became a lens through which Americans measured their own assumptions, beliefs, and anxieties. The effect was cumulative. Each day's content fed the next day's conversation, building a sense of continuity and inevitability that was difficult to resist or escape. International observers took note of this phenomenon as well. Governments, investors, and diplomats calculated their moves in the shadow of uncertainty. Global markets were sensitive to perception, not just policy, and uncertainty translated directly into volatility. Strategic decisions, long-term planning, and economic forecasting were all subtly reshaped by the idea that one individual, removed from formal office, could so fundamentally influence a nation's collective psyche. Ultimately, America had become a country suspended. Each citizen, institution, and political actor acted as though the next move might trigger irreversible consequences. The ordinary structures of time, governance, and daily life were refracted through the lens of anticipation. This was no longer just a political moment, it was a psychological one. The nation itself seemed to hold its breath, bracing for what might come, hoping for stability but preparing for upheaval. And as the days stretched forward, the quiet, pervasive anxiety remained the unspoken companion of every American, the undercurrent shaping not just political decisions, but personal ones as well. As the months progressed, the nation reached a point where uncertainty was no longer a temporary state, it had become structural, embedded in routines, conversations, and expectations. Americans moved through daily life under a persistent, almost imperceptible pressure, the weight of what was coming pressing on them as surely as gravity. The question was no longer if Trump loomed large, but how much the country would allow that looming to define every decision, public and private, in the year ahead. Every interaction seemed to echo with the same underlying question: what does the future hold, and who gets to shape it? The political calendar ticked forward, but in a distorted rhythm. Primaries, polling releases, and legislative sessions were filtered through the lens of anticipation rather than conventional policy debates. Every candidate outside the Trump orbit fought not just for votes, but for attention, recognition, and relevance. Their speeches and proposals were weighed against the backdrop of a man whose presence transcended conventional politics. Trump had not simply survived the past year, he had rewritten the terms of engagement. The electorate no longer measured success by legislation or debate performance but by proximity to, or opposition against, him. Courts, too, carried unprecedented symbolic weight. Decisions and delays were interpreted as signs, omens, and indicators of a broader national trajectory. Legal proceedings, once procedural, were now imbued with existential significance. For supporters, a postponed hearing was vindication; for critics, it was proof that justice was fragile. Each judgment and appeal became a microcosm of the nation's unresolved tension, demonstrating that institutional processes could no longer be viewed in isolation from the political and psychological currents swirling around them. The social fabric strained under this constant tension. Communities navigated fractures that had long existed but were now magnified. Conversations in workplaces, schools, and households grew more cautious, or in some cases, more pointed. Public spaces became arenas where civility was tested daily, often under the silent gaze of cameras and smartphones. Even private communication was colored by the awareness that discourse could ripple outward, becoming public, viral, and politically consequential. In this climate, Americans learned to speak with precision, to moderate their opinions, and often, to withhold them entirely. Meanwhile, Trump himself continued to assert influence without formal authority. His rallies, statements, and social media activity maintained a cadence that kept the nation in constant engagement. Each word, clip, or tweet was dissected, debated, and incorporated into the national conversation. He occupied not just the political space, but the psychological space of millions of citizens, shaping perceptions and framing the narrative of what mattered and what did not. To supporters, he remained a symbol of resolve; to critics, he was the embodiment of enduring disruption. To the undecided, he was a question mark they could not ignore. Economically, culturally, and socially, the country acted as though suspended in a state of anticipatory equilibrium. Businesses hedged decisions against the backdrop of uncertainty. Markets reacted to perception as much as data. Cultural production, art, film, literature, television, reflected themes of tension, resilience, and instability. Even leisure, usually a respite, became tinged with awareness that the world beyond recreation was restless, unpredictable, and politically charged. The nation's psychology and its daily routines were inextricably linked, each shaping the other in subtle, often invisible ways. Internationally, the United States projected the image of a country powerful yet fragile, a global actor with both influence and vulnerability. By the closing months of the year, the nation understood a quiet, inescapable truth: the presence of Trump was no longer a temporary crisis, it was an enduring force that shaped the very conditions of civic life. Americans had become conditioned to anticipate, analyze, and react in ways that ensured survival, coherence, and identity under his shadow. The questions of governance, democracy, and policy were now inseparable from questions of perception, psychology, and narrative control. The weight of what comes next was not hypothetical, it was present, pressing, and undeniably real. As the year ended once more, the country faced the horizon with caution and an acute awareness of its fragility. Americans had learned that the future was not merely a linear path of policy and elections, but a landscape defined by perception, influence, and endurance. The nation stepped forward into another year carrying both the lessons and the burdens of the one behind it, knowing that the shadow that loomed large over the past year would not vanish simply with the turning of a calendar. Instead, it would continue to shape the choices, fears, and hopes of every American, a reminder that some forces are enduring, and some questions remain unresolved for longer than anyone expects.